They said the man who dug the spiral was already dead inside. They said you could see it in his eyes, the way a lamp looks after the oil has burned down to nothing but the memory of flame. They said no sane man would claw a hole into a frozen hill and call it a home, and that the town of Cold Branch in the Dakota Territory had finally found a fool worse than the drunk who'd frozen to death behind the livery the winter before. And they laughed. Oh, how they laughed. They stood at the rail fence on the edge of his property and watched him haul dirt up out of the ground in a wooden sledge, day after day, and they called out things meant to wound. They called him the mole. They called him the grave digger digging his own grave. They said Elias Crane had lost what little mind a disgraced railroad man had left. But before we get to the night the sky turned white and 40 miles of prairie were swallowed whole, before the begging at the door, before the children carried in stiff as cordwood, we must first go back. We must find the man before the world decided what he was. To find him, we go back 3 years to the spring of 1883, to a railroad cut in the Black Hills where Elias Crane was, for the last time in his life, a man the world still respected. He was 41 years old that spring. He was a tunnel engineer, and he was a good one, better than good. The men who laid the iron called him the man who could hear the mountain. He had a way of pressing his bare hand against rock and going still, as though the stone were whispering to him where it wanted to break and where it would hold. He had cut passages through granite that older men swore could not be cut. He had brought a line through a pass that 2 companies had abandoned as impossible. He was not a loud man. He was not a man who drank with the crew or boasted in the camps. He kept to himself, and he kept a small tintype of a woman in his breast pocket, and he never once spoke her name aloud to anyone. Her name had been Mary. She had been dead 4 years by that spring, taken by a fever in a railroad town in Nebraska, while Elias was 60 miles away, blasting through a ridge he could not leave. He had ridden through the night to reach her and arrived to find the bed already stripped and a neighbor woman washing the floor. He never forgave the mountain for keeping him. He never forgave himself for choosing it. And after that, he gave the railroad everything he had, because the work was the only thing left that asked nothing of his heart and gave him a reason to be tired enough to sleep. So you can understand why what happened in the Black Hills broke something in him that the fever had not quite finished. There was a foreman on that line named Harlan Boyd, a heavy, florid man who answered to the company's money and to nothing else. Boyd wanted the tunnel through the shale ridge finished 3 weeks ahead of the season because a bonus rode on it, and the bonus was his. Elias laid his hand on that shale and went cold all the way down. The rock was rotten. It was full of seams that ran with water in the thaw, and it would not hold the roof of a tunnel the way solid stone would. He told Boyd they needed to shore it heavier, timber it close, go slow. He told him men would die if they rushed it. Boyd told him the timber would eat the bonus. Boyd told him to mind his measurements and leave the deciding to men who understood the value of $1. And when Elias refused to sign off on the work as safe, Boyd did a simple thing. He went to the company and he told them Elias Crane had been falsifying his surveys, padding his timber orders, selling the surplus lumber to a mill on the side, and pocketing the difference. None of it was true, but Boyd had ledgers, and Boyd had 2 men who would swear to anything for a week's wages, and Elias Crane had no one. He had no wife to speak for his character. He had no friends in the camp because he had never let anyone close enough. He had only his word. And a man's word, it turns out, is worth very little when richer men have decided to spend it. They branded him a fraud and a thief. They dismissed him without pay. Word ran ahead of him up and down every line in the territory, the way a grass fire runs ahead of the wind, and no company between St. Paul and the Rockies would hire the engineer who'd stolen from his crew. It did not matter that the charge was a lie. The lie traveled faster than the truth could follow, and the truth, by the time it limped into town, found every door already shut. 3 weeks after they fired him, the shale ridge came down. The roof of that tunnel collapsed in the thaw, exactly where Elias had pressed his hand and gone cold, and it buried 4 men under 100 tons of rotten rock.
Harlan Boyd told the inquest it was an act of God that no man could have foreseen, and nobody alive remembered, or chose to remember, that the disgraced thief they'd run off had stood in that very cut and said, "This stone will not hold." That is the wound Elias Crane carried into the Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1883. He had a little money he'd saved before the ruin. He had a wagon, a patient gray mule named Job, and a dog of no particular breed named Smoke, who had followed him out of a railroad camp and never left.
And he had a thing inside him that had gone quiet and hard, like a man who has stopped expecting the world to be fair and has decided only to survive it. He came to Cold Branch because it was far from the rails. It was a small, mean little town strung along a creek that froze solid by November, a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, a saloon, 2 streets of frame houses, and, scattered out across the prairie around it, the homesteads and the small ranches of the people who'd come to break that hard land. He bought a quarter section nobody wanted, a hillside of poor soil with a creek at the bottom and a long, north-facing slope that caught the worst of the wind. He bought it cheap because the man selling it laughed while he took the money. And then Elias Crane began to dig. He did not build a house. That was the first thing the town noticed and the first thing they couldn't forgive.
A sane man, come to that country, threw up 4 walls and a roof before the snow flew and prayed they'd hold. But Elias took one look at that north slope, pressed his hand against the cold earth of it the way he'd once pressed his hand to mountains, and he began to dig a tunnel into the hill. Not a straight one, a spiral. He cut into the slope and curved his passage gently as it went, turning it slowly inward and downward, like the chambered shell of a snail, like water circling a drain. The town could not make sense of it. A root cellar, maybe, they thought at first. And then it kept going. 10 feet, 20. He lined the walls and the curving roof with timber he cut and hauled himself, fitting it close and tight the way he'd once begged Harlan Boyd to let him timber a ridge. He framed a heavy door of double oak at the mouth. And around the first long curve, where the passage turned away from the entrance so that no straight line of wind could ever drive down it, he opened the tunnel into a chamber dug deep into the body of the hill. A room with earthen walls thicker than a man is tall on every side, with a flue cut up through 15 feet of soil to a chimney that barely showed above the grass. He moved a small iron stove into that buried room. He built a bunk, a table, shelves. He stored his food along the curving passage where the earth kept it cold but never frozen. And the people of Cold Branch, riding past on the road below, saw a strange man living in a hole in the ground with a mule and a dog, and they decided among themselves what he must be. The mole, the gravedigger, the madman of the north slope. Children dared each other to creep up and look at the door. Men at the saloon made him the butt of every slow evening. The widow Pearsall, who ran the boarding house and ran the gossip with it, declared at a church social that the man had clearly murdered someone somewhere and come here to hide from God and the law both, and that decent folks should keep their children away from him. And because no one knew the true story, because the only story that had traveled ahead of him was Harlan Boyd's lie, they had no reason to believe anything kinder. There was one who did not laugh. Her name was Sarah Tilden. She was 34 years old, a widow these 2 years, with a boy of 9 named Tom and a girl of 6 named Ruth, and a quarter section of her own a mile down the creek from Elias Crane's hill. Her husband had been thrown from a horse and killed the second autumn they were on the land, and she had refused, with a stubbornness that scandalized the town nearly as much as the mole did, to sell up and go back east to her brother in Ohio. She farmed that hard ground herself. She broke her own sod, and mended her own harness, and faced down her own loneliness. And she had a way of looking at a thing plainly that the rest of Cold Branch found uncomfortable. She met Elias Crane in the general store in the dead of October. He had come in for nails and lamp oil and flour, and the store had gone quiet the way it always did when he entered, the men turning their faces to the shelves, a low laugh starting somewhere in the corner. And Sarah Tilden, waiting at the counter with her 2 children pressed against her skirts, watched the disgraced engineer set his money down without meeting a single eye, and she watched him take his goods and turn to go. And as he passed, her little girl Ruth, who was 6 and did not yet know the rules of cruelty, looked up at the tall, quiet man and said, clear as a bell in the silent store, "Are you the man who lives in the ground?" The whole store held its breath, ready to laugh, and Elias Crane stopped. He looked down at the child, and something in his hard, quiet face moved, just slightly, like the first crack in spring ice. "I am," he said. "It's warm down there, warmer than you'd think." Ruth considered this with great seriousness. "Is it dark?" "I keep a lamp," he said, "and there's a window of sorts where the morning gets in." And then, because the child was looking at him the way no one in that town had looked at him in 3 years, without contempt, without fear, only with honest curiosity, he added, very quietly, "You and your mother would be welcome to see it, if she likes." The men by the shelves found that hilarious, but Sarah Tilden did not laugh. She looked at the man, and she looked at the way her daughter was looking at the man, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Crane. Perhaps we will." And she took her children and her goods, and she went out into the cold. And behind her the laughter rose up and broke against the door he'd already closed. It was a small thing, but the world turns on small things. They did go to see it, on a gray afternoon in early November, Sarah telling herself it was only neighborly, only curiosity, only that Ruth had asked 4 times. Elias met them at the oak door, plainly astonished that they had come, and he led them in, around the long, sheltering curve of the passage, the wind cutting off behind them as though a hand had closed over it, and into the buried room where the little stove glowed and the lamp was lit, and the air was so warm that the children's cheeks went pink within a minute of stepping inside. Sarah Tilden stood in that warm, earthen room and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt safe. She had not felt fully safe, not down in her bones, since the morning they'd carried her husband in. And here, 15 feet inside a hill that the whole town called a madman's burrow, with the cold shut out behind a curve of solid earth, she felt the kind of safety she remembered from being a child in a deep cellar during a summer storm, the thunder gone soft and far away. "You built this," she said. It was not quite a question. "I did." "Why a spiral? Why not straight in?" And Elias Crane looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't looked at anyone in years, because she had asked the one question nobody else had thought to ask. They'd all asked what and laughed at the answer. She'd asked why. "A straight passage," he said slowly, "is a barrel for the wind. Storm comes from the north, it'll drive straight down a straight hole and put your fire out and freeze you in your bed. But the wind can't turn a corner. It can't follow a curve. The cold comes to that first bend and it stops because it's got nothing to push against." He paused. "I learned it cutting tunnels. The mountain teaches you if you'll listen. Most men won't listen." Sarah Tilden looked at the curving wall and the warm chamber, and the careful timbering fitted close as a cabinet maker's work, and she understood, standing there, that she was not looking at the work of a madman. She was looking at the work of a man who understood something the rest of them did not, and who had been laughed at for it by people who had never once pressed a hand to anything and listened. "They're fools," she said. "The whole town. They're fools." Elias said nothing. But he made coffee, strong and black and good, and he gave the children molasses on bread, and Smoke, the dog, let little Ruth bury her hands in his fur, and for the first time in a very long time, the buried room was not a hermit's hole, but something nearer to a home. That was the beginning of the thaw. Not the love of it. That came slower and quieter, and neither of them would have dared to name it for a long while yet. But the friendship of it began that November afternoon, and it grew through the early winter in small, plain ways. Elias took to riding down to the Tilden place to help with the heavy work a widow couldn't manage alone, mending the barn roof before the snow, splitting a winter's wood, doctoring a sick cow with a patience that surprised her. He didn't say much. He just did the work and took his coffee and went home to his hill. But Tom, the 9-year-old, who had started out sullen and suspicious of any man stepping into his dead father's place, began to follow Elias around and hand him tools, and Ruth declared the mole man her particular friend. And Sarah, for her part, began sending the children up the hill with covered dishes, a pot of beans baked all day with salt pork, a loaf still warm, once a whole dried apple pie that Elias ate slowly over 3 evenings, as though it were communion. He had not eaten food made by a woman's hands since Mary died.
He had forgotten what it did to a man, that kind of care. He had forgotten that warmth could come in through the stomach and reach all the way up to the place behind the breastbone, where grief had been living rent-free for years. The town noticed, of course. The town always noticed. The widow Pearsall let it be known that Sarah Tilden was carrying on shameful with the murderer in the hill, and that it was a wonder those poor children weren't dead in a ditch already. The Reverend Pruitt, a thin, anxious man more afraid of his congregation's opinion than of his own God, paid a call on Sarah and suggested gently that her conduct was being remarked upon. Sarah Tilden gave the Reverend a cup of coffee and a piece of her mind in roughly equal measure and sent him back to town with neither his point made nor his coffee finished. But here is the thing about a small, mean town. It can laugh at a man for years. What it cannot abide is being proven wrong.
And the winter of 1885, the winter that was coming down on them now like a held breath about to break, was going to prove them wrong about Elias Crane in a way none of them would ever forget. It began with the geese. Elias was up on his hill in the second week of January when he stopped his work and stood listening, the way he listened to stone. There were geese going over. Not the ragged few that drifted south through the proper autumn, but flock after flock after flock, a great pouring river of them strung across the whole gray sky, all driving south together with a haste that was almost panic. He had grown up reading weather the way some men read scripture. He went still, and he felt the air, and he found that it had gone strange. Heavy and dead and warmer than January had any right to be, with a faint metallic taste at the back of the throat that he had felt only twice before in his life. He went down the hill to the Tilden place that same afternoon, faster than his usual easy ride, and he found Sarah taking wash off the line. "There's weather coming," he said. "Bad weather, the worst I've felt." She looked at the sky, which was only soft and gray and mild. "It's been the gentlest week we've had all winter." "That's the warning," he said. "It's the air drawing its breath. You feel how still it's gone? The geese have been going over all day, the whole flyway, every flock for 100 miles, and they don't fly like that unless something's driving them." He took off his hat and turned it in his hands, which she had learned was the thing he did when he was about to say something that mattered. "Sarah, when it comes, it's going to come fast, and it's going to come hard, and a frame house out on this prairie is not going to be enough. I want you to bring the children up to the hill, tonight if you can, tomorrow at the latest. The room will hold against anything. It will keep you warm if the fire goes out entirely. Your house will not." Now you must understand what he was asking. He was asking a widow whose reputation the town was already tearing to pieces to move herself and her 2 children into the buried home of the man they called a murderer, with no walls between them but the curve of a tunnel and the eyes of the whole county fixed on her. It was an impossible thing to ask. It was the kind of thing that could finish a woman in a place like Cold Branch for good. And Sarah Tilden looked at this man who had never once in 3 months given her a reason to doubt him, who built warmth into the ground itself and gave it away to her children, who listened to geese and stone and grief, and she made her choice the way she made all her choices, plainly and without flinching. "We'll come tomorrow," she said. "I'll need a day to bring what we'll need." But here is where I must tell you that Elias Crane did not stop at the Tilden place. Because he was a decent man, and a decent man cannot warn only the people who were kind to him. He rode into Cold Branch that same evening, into the teeth of every sneer the town had ready for him, and he stood in the doorway of the general store where the men were gathered around the stove, and he told them what was coming. "There's a storm building," he said, "bigger than anything this country's seen. I've felt it twice before, once in the mountains. You've got a day, maybe less. Bring your stock in close. Run lines between your houses and your barns so you don't lose yourselves between them. Lay in wood and water inside your walls, more than you think you'll ever need, because once it starts, you will not be able to step outside your own door and live." He looked around at their faces. "I'm telling you this because men died once when I warned them and they wouldn't listen. Don't be those men." For a moment there was silence. And then Harvey Pearsall, the widow's grown son, a big, loud man who'd inherited his mother's tongue, started to laugh. "The moles read the future in the goose droppings," he said, and the store laughed with him. "Tell us, gravedigger, did the worms whisper it to you down in your hole?" And the storekeeper, not unkindly but firmly, told Elias Crane that they appreciated the thought, but that the almanac said a mild winter, and the almanac had never lived in a hole in the ground. And they laughed him out the door, every one of them, and he rode home through the soft gray dusk with the laughter following him out onto the prairie. And he thought, "I have done what I can. God forgive them. I have done what I can." The Tildens came up the hill the next morning. Elias had spent half the night enlarging the storage along the passage and laying in more wood than 3 families could burn, hauling water from the creek before it could lock up, fitting a second bunk into a side chamber he'd dug off the main room for the children. Sarah brought blankets and what food stores she had, and her dead husband's rifle, and the 2 children came wide-eyed and half-delighted, treating the whole thing as a grand adventure, which is the mercy God gives to children at the edge of terrible things. And they had not been settled an hour, the kettle not yet hot, when the light outside the oak door began to change. It came out of the northwest, and Elias, standing at the mouth of his tunnel, watched it come. It was not like an ordinary storm building up in towers. It was a wall.
A solid, moving wall of blue-black cloud that ran from the ground to the top of the sky and stretched from one end of the horizon to the other, and it came on across the prairie faster than a horse could run, and ahead of it the grass lay flat, and the air went dead, and the few cattle in the far fields turned their tails to it and began to drift. The temperature did not fall. It dropped, the way a stone drops down a well, 60 degrees in the space of minutes, so that the breath that had fogged warm in front of his face was suddenly freezing in his beard. "Inside," Elias said quietly, "all of you, now." And then the wall hit, and the world ended. I have heard old men who lived through that winter try to describe what came down on the Dakota Territory in the middle of January 1885, and I have watched them give up because there are no words built for it. The wind did not blow. It screamed, a single, unbroken shriek that did not pause for breath for 3 days and 3 nights. The snow did not fall. It came sideways, fine and hard as ground glass, so thick that a man holding his own lantern at arm's length could not see the flame. The cold was a living animal with teeth. Out on that prairie, the temperature fell to 40 degrees below freezing, and then below that, and the wind drove it through any gap, any seam, any crack, and found any living thing not deep behind solid walls, and killed it where it stood. And in the buried room on the north slope, around the sheltering curve where the wind came to the first bend and could not turn it, Elias Crane and Sarah Tilden and 2 children and a mule and a dog sat warm. That is the thing you must hold on to. They were warm. The little stove ticked and glowed, and 15 feet of earth on every side held the cold out as surely as it held the warmth in, and the curve of the passage broke the wind's back so completely that they could hear it raging far off at the door like something locked out and furious, while inside Ruth fell asleep in a nest of blankets with her hand in the dog's fur. Elias kept the fire low and steady, feeding it carefully, and the smoke went up the flue and was snatched away into the screaming dark, and the warmth stayed. He had built it true. He had pressed his hand to the hill and listened, and the hill had told him true, and now the thing the whole town had laughed at was the only reason 4 people on that slope were going to see the spring. 3 days the storm held. 3 days of wind that screamed without resting, 3 days of cold that would freeze the marrow in standing bone. 3 days of a darkness so complete behind that whirling wall of white that day and night lost their meaning, and they kept time only by the stove and by sleep. Sarah cooked. Of course she cooked. It was how she loved, with her hands, the same as Elias built.
She made the salt pork and beans stretch and baked bread in the iron oven set in the stove, and the smell of it filled the buried room, and the children ate and were warm and were safe, while a mile away their own frame house stood dark and abandoned and slowly filling with snow driven in through every crack. And on the second night, in the low orange light, with the children asleep, Sarah Tilden looked across the little table at Elias Crane and asked him the question she had been carrying for 3 months. "What did you do," she said gently, "that made them say what they say about you? I've never believed it, but I'd like to hear it from you."
And so, for the first time since it happened, Elias Crane told someone the truth. He told her about Mary and the fever and the 60 miles he couldn't cross in time. He told her about Harlan Boyd and the rotten shale and the warning no one heeded. He told her about the lie that traveled faster than the truth and the 4 men who died under the rock he'd said would fall, and how he'd come north to a place far from the rails to dig himself a quiet hole and wait to die in it. His voice did not break. He told it plainly, the way the narrator of a sad story tells it. But when he was done, Sarah Tilden reached across the table and put her work-roughened hand over his, and she did not say she was sorry, because sorry was a small word, and this was a large grief. She only held his hand while the storm screamed itself hoarse against the door, and that was enough. That was more than enough.
It was the first time in years a living soul had touched Elias Crane and meant it, and something inside him that had been frozen since a railroad town in Nebraska began, very quietly, to thaw. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. It did not taper, it simply stopped the way the wall had hit, all at once, between one breath and the next, and the silence that came after it was so vast and so total that it woke them all. Elias went to the oak door and had to dig the snow back from it with a shovel kept inside for that purpose, and then he stepped out into a world he did not recognize. The sky was a hard, depthless blue. The sun was up and blazing and gave no warmth at all, and the prairie was gone.
Every fence, every road, every familiar shape of the land had been erased and made new under a smooth, blinding, unbroken sheet of white that ran to the horizon in every direction, humped and carved into long frozen waves by the wind, and dazzling so fiercely that he had to shield his eyes. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. It was beautiful, and it was the most terrible thing he had ever seen, because he knew what lay under that beautiful smoothness, out where the houses had been. Down in the white distance, where the town should have stood, a few thin threads of smoke rose straight up into the windless air. A few, not many, far too few. "Sarah," he said, coming back in, and his face told her before his words did. "It's stopped. I have to go down there. The town. There won't have been near enough that listened." She did not argue. She knew him by now. She only said, "Take Job, take the lines,
"And come back to me." And the last 3 words landed between them with a weight that neither of them had spoken before, and neither now needed to explain. Elias Crane harnessed the gray mule to a sledge and loaded it with wood and with food and with every blanket they could spare, and he tied a rope around his waist and another to landmarks he knew lay buried under the snow, and he set out across the frozen waste toward the threads of smoke. The going was brutal. The drifts in places were higher than the mule's back, and in others the wind had scoured the ground to bare frozen earth, and the cold, though the wind was gone, was a still and patient cold that pressed in on every side. It took him most of the morning to cross a mile and a half that he could ride in 20 minutes in summer. And what he found in Cold Branch he never afterward spoke of fully, even to Sarah. Some had listened, a little.
Some had laid in wood and lived, huddled in single rooms around dying stoves, their faces gray with cold and fear, having burned their furniture and their fence rails, and in 2 cases their interior doors to keep the smallest fire going. The town had not been buried in the way the legend later told it, but it had come close, closer than any of them had ever been to dying, and the storm had reached in through every gap their flimsy frame houses offered and taken what it could. It had taken the Halverson boy, who'd gone out the first night to bring in a calf, and lost the wall of the house in the white, and was found 100 feet from his own door. It had taken old Peter Vandermeer, alone in his shack, whose fire had gone out, and who had not had the strength to start it again. and it had very nearly taken the entire Pearsall household, the widow and her loud son Harvey, who had laughed in the store, and Harvey's young wife and their 3 children, because the boarding house had a great drafty parlor, and Harvey had laid in barely a day's wood. Certain the almanac knew better than the mole. By the time Elias broke through the drift against their door, they had burned every stick of furniture in the place and were huddled together under every blanket and rug they owned in a single corner, the children blue-lipped and silent in that terrible way that means a child is past crying, the fire down to a few coals, and the widow Pearsall, who had told the whole county that Elias Crane was a murderer come to hide from God, looked up from that freezing corner and saw the man she had slandered standing in her doorway with the cold blue sky behind him and a sledge of firewood at his back, and she began to weep. He did not say one word about the store, not one. He built up their fire, and he fed them, and he wrapped the children in the blankets he'd brought, and then he went out and broke a trail to the next house, and the next, all that day and into the failing light, hauling wood and food from his own stores and from the general store, whose owner gave freely now and would not meet Elias's eye. And when the worst of the immediate danger was past, when no one in Cold Branch was going to freeze in the next hours, Elias Crane did the thing that turned the laughter, at last and forever, into something else. He told them to come to the hill, because the cold was not done. A still, killing cold had settled over the whole territory and would not lift for days, and the town's stores of wood were nearly gone, burned through in the panic of the storm, and another night or two like the last would finish what the blizzard had started. The buried room could not hold all of them, but the spiral passage could.
That long, curving, sheltered tunnel, warm down its whole length from the chamber's fire and the close earth, was the safest place for 40 miles. And so they came. The whole shivering remnant of Cold Branch came up the north slope on the second day, the strong carrying the weak, Harvey Pearsall carrying old Peter Vandermeer's widowed sister on his back through the drifts, and they crowded into the warm, curving tunnel of the man they had called a madman, and they sat down on the floor of the gravedigger's grave, and they did not freeze. Sarah Tilden moved among them with coffee and with broth, and the children of Cold Branch, who 3 weeks before had dared each other to throw snowballs at the mole's door, slept in rows down the passage in the warmth that came out of the hill. And Ruth Tilden, 6 years old, walked up to the widow Pearsall, who was wrapped in a borrowed blanket with her hands around a hot tin cup, and said, with the same clear innocence she'd shown in the store, "This is the man who lives in the ground. He kept us warm the whole time. Isn't it nice down here?" And the widow Pearsall, who had never in her life been at a loss for a cruel word, had no word at all. She only looked down the warm, curving tunnel full of the people he had saved, and then up at the quiet man feeding his careful fire, and she covered her face with her cold hands and wept for the second time in 2 days. And this time it was shame. They stayed 3 days more until the cold broke enough for them to make their houses livable again. And in those 3 days, something happened down in that buried passage that no storm could have done and no sermon could have taught. The people of Cold Branch came to know Elias Crane. Not the legend, not the lie that had traveled ahead of him, the man. They watched him ration the wood with an engineer's care so it would last them all. They watched him doctor frostbite and calm frightened children and give up his own bunk to a sick old woman. They heard from Sarah in pieces the true story of the railroad and the rotten shale and the men who died because no one would listen to the man who could hear the mountain. And they understood, slowly and with a deepening shame, that the warning he'd given them in the store, the warning they'd laughed at, was the same warning he'd given Harlan Boyd, and that both times he'd been right, and both times the men with the loud, certain voices had been catastrophically wrong. And the only difference was that this time he'd built a hill that saved the fools who wouldn't hear him. When at last they filed out and went back down to their houses, they went changed. Harvey Pearsall stopped at the door, the big, loud man gone quiet, and he stood in front of Elias and could not find the words, and finally he just put out his hand, and Elias Crane, who had every right in the world to refuse it, took it and shook it, because he was not a man who held a grievance the way the world had held one against him. "Lay in more wood next time," was all he said, and Harvey Pearsall laughed, a real laugh now, raw and humble, and said he would lay in wood till the day he died, and from what I am told, he did. The spring came, as it always does, even after the worst of winters. The snow melted off the prairie and ran down into the creek, and out where the houses stood, they found the ones the storm had taken and buried them properly when the ground thawed. The whole town at the graveside, the Reverend Pruitt preaching on the foolishness of pride and the worth of a warning, and not one soul in the congregation who didn't know exactly whom he meant.
And Elias Crane married Sarah Tilden that spring in the little church with the leaning steeple, and the same town that had called her shameful for sending covered dishes up the hill now packed the pews to bursting and wept openly when the disgraced engineer and the stubborn widow took their plain vows. They built a proper house, in time, a good frame house with thick walls and a deep cellar, but they never tore out the spiral. They kept the buried room as it was, and on the coldest nights of the winters that followed, the family would go down into the warm heart of the hill together, and Elias would tell the children how the wind cannot turn a corner, and how you must always, always listen to what the stone is trying to tell you. Word of it spread, the way words do, but this time the truth traveled, and it traveled far. The railroad, some years on, when Harlan Boyd had finally been caught falsifying ledgers on another line and the whole rotten business came apart in his hands, sent a quiet letter to a man named Elias Crane in the Dakota Territory, clearing his name and offering him his old position back at a generous wage. Elias read the letter at his own table, with his wife beside him and his children grown half wild and happy on the land around him, and he folded it carefully, and he wrote back 3 lines, thanking them and declining. He had found work that suited him better, he wrote.
He was a farmer now, and a husband, and a father, and on the side, he had become something the territory had badly needed all along. For in the years after that terrible winter, people came to Elias Crane from 100 miles around to learn how to build their root cellars and their soddies and their homes against the killing cold, how to set a passage so the wind couldn't drive down it, how to put 15 feet of earth between a sleeping child and 40 below. And he taught them. He taught anyone who'd come. The man they'd called a gravedigger spent the rest of his life teaching people how not to die. Years later, travelers passing through that country would be told the story by the old-timers at the store, how there was a hill north of town with a strange spiral cut into it, and how once, in the great winter of 1885, when the blizzard came down and buried the prairie and the proud went cold in their fine frame houses, the only warm place for 40 miles was the burrow of the man everyone had laughed at, and how the very people who'd mocked him came crawling to his door, and how he opened it without a word of reproach and let them in. And the old-timers would shake their heads, and they would say the thing that was the truest thing in the whole story, the thing the audience has known in its heart since the beginning. There was never anything wrong with Elias Crane. The wrong was in a world too proud and too loud to listen to a quiet man who pressed his hand against the cold and heard what was coming.
They called him a madman for building warmth where no one thought to look for it. They called him a fraud for telling a truth that cost rich men money. But the earth does not reward the loudest voice, or the richest man, or the one most certain he is right. The earth, like God, rewards the one who is willing to be still and to listen and to build a true thing patiently in the dark while the whole world stands at the fence and laughs. And when the wind finally came, as the wind always comes, it was the listener and the woman who'd believed him and the children who'd asked him why instead of what, who sat warm in the heart of the hill while the storm screamed itself out against a door it could never turn the corner to reach. That is the story of the spiral on the North Slope.
And if you are ever out in that country, in the deep of a Dakota winter, and you feel the air go strange and still, and you look up and see the geese pouring south in a hurry, you might do well to remember the quiet man they laughed at and ask yourself whether the thing your own neighbors are calling foolish might not be the very thing that saves them. For the world is full of people pressing their hands against the cold, hearing what is coming. The only question that has ever mattered is whether anyone will trouble themselves to listen.